what we've had to devote, what the average family has had to devote to food, clothing, and shelter, those basics, has dropped from over 50% of the average family budget to just a little over 30%. And now something very, very interesting. We superimpose this green here, which is health. Remember that scary chart we saw with how healthcare was rising and rising and rising as a percentage of the family budget? Well, if you put together food, clothing, and shelter, the red line, with healthcare, the green line, we get this brown bar, and you will notice that the total amount has dropped from about 50% to, it has remained constantly roughly at about 50%. In other words, now we're talking in the aggregate, we're talking about average here. Folks come back to that in a moment. But on average, the reality is that the entire increase in healthcare spending for the average American has been made up for by decreases in what has had to be spent on food, clothing, and shelter. Okay? And this doesn't even include other increases in productivity that have decreased things we have to spend on resources. For example, look at 1958, it took the average worker about 325 hours to earn enough money to buy a refrigerator, about 145, 146 hours to buy a dishwasher, and a little less than that to buy a washing machine. Well, look what's happened by 1997, how dramatically the productivity increases in manufacturing these cause how many hours do you have to spend? Just a little over 50 on the average to be able to purchase a refrigerator, and similar drops with regard to washing machines and dishwashers. Okay? So all of this means that the reality is that it's simply false to say that as a society we can't afford these rising healthcare costs. Because, you see, people have it exactly backwards. Most people think about rising healthcare costs as being sort of generated by this cost push, and that we're spending more and more money for the same healthcare, and it keeps rising and rising, and nobody can understand why it's rising out of control. Whereas what in fact is happening is that we're spending less and less money for other things, which is giving us more resources, which we are using in order to buy more and better healthcare, which is resulting in longer lives and significant decreases in disability. Okay? Now, so it is, in fact, contrary to the conventional wisdom. It simply is not true that in the aggregate as a society we can't afford to continue to fund healthcare. Now, there are, however, some real problems. And one of the most fundamental points here is the issue of distribution. Because we've been talking about the average family. Well, of course, not everybody, in fact, most people are not quote-unquote average. There are people who are above average and there are people who are below average. And if you look again at this indication of the percentage of the family budget devoted to health care, the average family budget, back in 1940, suppose that you had half the average family income. Well, that would mean that instead of health care taking up about 3%, it would take about 6% of your budget. Well, that would be a hit, but it might be sustainable. But now look at 2006, when health care is taking up nearly 18% of the average family budget. If your budget is not average, but is half, okay, then that means we're talking about healthcare taking up 35, 36% of your entire budget. And that may not be sustainable. And that is a fundamental reason why those with less than average income increases have genuine difficulty coping with these healthcare cost increases. And that has led to a significant rise in the number of people who are uninsured among those with low income. Now, here's the next critically important problem. Remember that what's happening in the general economy, people who are privately covered, is that on average, increases in productivity in other goods and services are freeing up resources to pay for health care. But now what happens if you've got somebody who is low income and can't afford health care? Well, often what happens is that the government pays for it, let's say with Medicaid. All right? The government tries to pay for it with Medicaid. Now, critically important point. This is absolutely essential to understand what I'm about to talk about now. Here's a pie chart that shows you the federal budget, fiscal year 2007. And one could look at a similar pie chart, slightly different categories for the Massachusetts budget. Now notice that when you take Medicare with 13% and other health care things, including Medicaid and S-CHIP and so forth, another 10%, that takes up a quarter of the federal budget. But now, look at the other sorts of things that are in the federal budget. Social Security, 20%. Defense, 20%. Interest on the national debt, 8%. Okay? Income security, unemployment compensation, and so forth, 13%. Now, here's the critically important point to understand. Unlike food, clothing, shoes, and housing, we cannot expect that productivity increases are going to decrease the proportion of the federal budget that is needed to pay for these sorts of things. Social Security, for example, we're facing the retirement of the baby boom generation. We're not going to see a decrease in what has to be spent on Social Security. We're going to see an increase. Okay? Interest on the national debt, we're running deficits, to reach the sky to cope with the recession and for other purposes. That interest is not going to decrease, it's going to increase. And if you look at each of these other items, you will realize that very few, if any of them, are the sort of things that we can expect to have an increase in productivity lead to a decrease in what the government needs to spend on those as a proportion of the budget. So what does this mean? What this means is that we have a fundamental problem, a fundamental gap. People who get private insurance are able, even though they don't feel like this, because of constantly rising productivity increases on other things, to put more and more resources into their health care. Okay? Which means that the quote-unquote cost of health care rises at a rate significantly and outpaces that of nominal average inflation. But the government, when the government is trying to keep up with that in subsidizing people who can't afford it, the government's resources for health care are not similarly expanding. It can't, in a certain sense it profits from productivity increases because as the general economy gets better, not like right now, then the revenues that are based on that economy are going to increase and the pie will get bigger. But they will only rise with the general economy. They won't rise in proportion to the extra amount that's being devoted to health care. So the result is that we wind up with the government constantly being forced to meet budgetary constraints on what it can pay to subsidize health care. And what happens? Well, the government starts putting limits on the reimbursement rates that it gives to doctors and hospitals and other healthcare providers. And those reimbursement rates fall below the actual cost of providing health care. So if you look at this chart, you will notice, for example, over here, what about people who are uninsured? That's the most obvious case. The federal law says, under something called EMTALA, that a hospital emergency room has to see anybody, regardless of their ability to pay. Well, what happens? Well, only 28% on average across the country of the cost of covering the uninsured in hospital emergency rooms is covered by those people who show up. So you've got that great big gap. Then we look at Medicaid. Medicaid, on average, covers only about 86% of the real cost of treating people on Medicaid. Medicare, older people, the Medicare reimbursement rates on average cover only about 91%, 91.3% of the real cost of treating older people. So where is that money going to come from? It has to come from somewhere. People are showing up in emergency rooms, people are on Medicaid, people on Medicare, doctors are treating them, hospitals are treating them. Here's where it comes from. It comes from something known as private sector cost